Right, and for example, if these talks happen, then what are we expecting from, let's say, for example, Iran, Israel, or the United States to, like, realistically, to give up something in
Yes.
these talks?
Well, so again, a great question. The WION newscasters always ask the best questions. So the Americans and the Israelis have divergent objectives, it seems to me, that have become more apparent as the war has gone on. Which is that, again, Israel seeks the annihilation of Iran. It seeks to destroy the infrastructure. They've been, like I said before, they've attacked hospitals in Tehran, just like they've done in Gaza and what they're now doing in Beirut. They're taking that same template and applying it to Iran. The United States, as I said before, seems to have been more interested in things like destroying the Iranian Navy. Trump is sort of always going on about this and attacking militarily relevant targets, which I would have suspected are, I don't know, a lot of them must have been struck already. Now, then but again, what's the connection of these on the American side of these targets to an achievable political objective? That's not known. It's never been explained. And now we have the Iranians. They also, like the Israelis, it seems to me, have a pretty clear set of objectives. The first of which is survival of the state and the regime, right? They're facing an existential threat, which is how they're acting, which is accurate, of course, I think. The second thing they want is guarantees that they're not going to be facing strikes again in another 3 or 4 months. They want guarantees. They're not interested in a quote unquote deal, which Trump keeps referencing. They want a comprehensive agreement, not just a ceasefire. And then there's this sort of issue again of what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. And this is, again, an interesting development. The Iranians setting up a toll booth at the Strait. And the rumor is, of course, that India, Turkey, and even some of the European countries, the Chinese as well, are engaged in diplomacy with the Iranians to pay the tolls to get their ships through the Gulf. Then there's the issue of war reparations. This was an unprovoked attack, an illegal attack, according to international law. And I think the Iranians justifiably feel that the Iranians and the United States should bear the cost of war reparations. So again, the onset of hostilities has introduced a whole new set of very difficult issues into any kind of negotiated settlement. And I don't see the United States and these two interlocutors that Trump has put into the process. Neither one of them has the expertise really to work on these sort of complicated things. Trump needs professional, competent diplomats, most of whom, of course, have been removed because he doesn't want the kinds of knowledgeable advisors around him. And he's got his Secretary of State, for example, wandering around blockading Cuba while this is all going on. I mean, it's just, what we're seeing here in the grand scheme of things, it seems to me, is the complete disintegration of American influence and power all over the world. Trump is just destroying it single-handedly, virtually. And the Iranians must find this, I think, as confusing as we, the Americans, do, as we're watching the United States sort of disintegrate, as this president of ours, says one thing, does something else. He's all over the map. It's difficult to make sense of any of it.
Right, and right now we're talking about the Strait of Hormuz, and we have seen some reports that are indicating that Iran is demanding $2 million per ship for quote unquote safe passage. And if the shipping company pays this to, for example, IRGC linked entities, aren't they sort of funding the very blockade? And is this like a temporary tax, the wartime temporary tax that we are talking about in the Strait of Hormuz, or are we going to see this, in other canals as well?
I think this is, again, a great question, and it's one of the issues that's been raised in this whole conflagration, which is Iran's insistence now that it is going to start taking the tolls from countries that want to use the strait. And so this raises, again, a whole host of different issues. And of course, the press reports indicate that the countries are reaching out. We have heard, again, do we know this is true? We don't. This is not verifiable, but supposedly the Pakistanis, the Turks, the Chinese, and there are rumors that the Europeans and the Japanese have also made contact with the Iranians to talk to them about getting their ships through the strait, which would imply that they'd be paying for this toll tax. And we also have to, again, remember that in this context, Iran is exporting more oil than it ever has before because Trump has lifted sanctions on Iranian oil, which again, so they are able to get their own ships out and onto the market and engage in these commercial transactions, which again is also helping the Iranian war effort, so to speak. I mean, he's done the same things for the Russians. So again, which the Russians supposedly America's enemy, and now Trump has been forced to remove the sanctions on Russian oil again with the hope of getting more oil onto the market and keeping gas prices in the U.S. down. So again, you are left with this impression that Trump and his advisors are making all of this up as they go along, and there's no sort of structure to it at all. Now, in their defense, you have to sort of say that all diplomacy is a bit like this. There's a lot of the seat of the pants kind of decision making that has to happen, particularly in these kinds of crisis situations. But in this particular case, the United States, it's like, as I said before, it's the yin and the yang, and we never know what words are going to come out of Trump's mouth. One day he says we have strong discussions with the Iranians, and we're all sort of like, oh, wow, wouldn't this be great? But then tomorrow he could, appear on TV and say, no, now we're escalating and we're going after these power grids that I said were off limits. I mean, he's completely unpredictable, which can have its uses, of course, in a bargaining framework. But honestly, I think what all of us would feel more comfortable with was a little more stability and adult-like conduct in this kind of dangerous situation. We're in an extremely dangerous situation right now in terms of potential escalations. We all forget that the Iranians have it in their capacity to deal mortal blows to the Gulf states by hitting the desalinated water. These places couldn't exist without desalinated water, and yet the Iranians have so far held off on hitting them. In other words, there's lots of additional things that could happen which would represent a serious escalation, and we should be doing everything in our power to avoid this. And I wish I thought we had leadership in the United States that was devoted to seeking some kind of orderly extrication from hostilities to a comprehensive set of negotiations. But I don't see it, unfortunately, and as regrettable as that is.
Right, and you just mentioned, desalination plant, and we'll just shift to that. And if this 5-day pause fails, are we like looking at a scenario where West Asia just doesn't lose the oil exports because the choke point is completely shut off for them, but actual access to drinking water and electricity for millions? Are we looking at that scenario as well?
Let me just say at the outset that I hope it doesn't happen. We should all be lobbying our governments to de-escalate and to seek a peaceful resolution to this dispute. But again, in the bargaining framework that we are looking at here, we look at the different interests of the respective parties, the Israelis, the Americans, and the Iranians. There's some pretty significant differences between these three parties. The Israelis, for example, they're a wild card in the whole kind of scenario that we're laying out here. I don't think the Israelis are happy to see the Gulf states have reduced cohesiveness and reduced economic power. It goes with their sort of idea of how to achieve their vision of greater Israel, with Israel having military and political hegemony throughout the region, right? So that they wouldn't necessarily be opposed to steps that would see attacks on things like desalination plants that would hurt the infrastructure of the Gulf states. And the same, of course, for the Iranians. This would fit with their objectives. For the United States, right? The implications of this are very serious because it creates the prospect of a humanitarian catastrophe, but it also effectively sort of means the end of the American military presence in the Gulf, because the Gulf states are facing this kind of situation where they're going to be forced to choose, right? And stay allied with the American-Israeli partnership, or go their own way and have, again, this idea of closer relationships with the Iranians. And then there's the Strait of Hormuz toll booth now, which is in play. And if we see, as I said, this kind of circumstance where the Iranians now get to veto who's coming in and out of the Gulf, this is something that the Gulf states also have to be extremely worried about. So the scenarios that you're talking about here, which I should also hasten to add, regrettably include the strikes on each other's nuclear facilities. This is the Iranian strikes on Dimona that came after the Israelis hit the Iranian enrichment site at Esfahan. All of these things can spiral out of control very quickly. And this is, again, another characteristic. When war starts, when the shooting starts,
Right.
it becomes increasingly difficult for political leaders to control that escalation. They get swept along with it, right? And the decision making becomes much more haphazard, which is, again, a feature of war, and it's one of the great, sort of mistakes that political leaders make when they engage in the use of force in thinking that they can control this escalation. It starts to be taken out of their control. Circumstances force them into taking certain kinds of actions. And if we end up in a situation in 4 or 5 days when Trump says, "Oh, the talks, haven't gone anywhere," who knows what could happen? I mean, it's just an absolutely terrible situation.
Right, right, James. Well, we are actually running out of time, but we got all of the answers from you actually, and we'll just wait and see on this 5-day pause. But thank you so much for joining us today on WION World is One. Thank you.